Hey guys! So, nothing lasts forever. This phrase applies to absolutely everything in our world, including technical means. Some of them become obsolete and are disposed of, while others are simply abandoned in various unusual places where they remain forever, covered in rust and fallen leaves. If you love science fiction, then you've probably heard of its subgenre, steampunk, which envisions our planet without electricity and internal combustion engines, with steam engines being the main source of energy. The following steam-powered machines will probably appeal to fans of this genre. It's hard to say why so much metal hasn't been recycled yet. However, we do know the purpose of this equipment. It played a crucial role in building the 145-kilometer-long Davidson Ditch conduit in Alaska in the 1920s. The pipeline was needed to supply water to dredges used for gold mining. Most likely, similar excavators were used for the construction of the Panama Canal a few years earlier. When the conduit project was completed, the equipment was no longer needed, so it sat idle for nearly a century. Looking at these machines, you can even make out the name of the place where they were manufactured: Evansville, Indiana. One of the largest self-propelled vehicles created by humans is the bucket-wheeled excavator. The first bucket-wheel excavator was built in Germany in 1916. This marked the beginning of the development of this type of industry, and after the end of World War II, German companies became the world leaders in the production of these massive excavators, introducing many models to the world. Years went by, new equipment was designed, while the old machines were retired. Some of the old equipment was melted down, some ended up in museums, and some remained abandoned near the places where they once worked. One such abandoned excavator is the Bagger 258. This excavator was built by 1964 and looks like a dwarf compared to its elder brothers. It's only 171 meters long and 50 meters high, whereas the largest bucket wheel excavator measures 225 by 96 meters. However, it is still a huge piece of equipment, and you'll definitely feel that if you stand next to its tracks. The Buran program was supposed to be the Soviet Union's response to the American space shuttle program. Buran was supposed to give the USSR an advantage in space, but it never happened. The only Buran that made it into space was a test vehicle, and it happened in 1988. Although many shuttles were built, none of them ever made it into space. Two of them still lie and rust in an abandoned hangar near Baikonur Cosmodrome in Kazakhstan. There is no information about the completion of these vehicles, but they seem to be finished. The Burans are filled with 1980s technology. These shuttles look intact, only covered in a thick layer of dust and bird droppings. They were never destined to lift off into space. This is a full-size model of a space shuttle fuel tank. This model was built by NASA, but they never intended to use it on an actual flight. Instead, its purpose was to analyze the design. The study lasted 3 years, from 1977 to 1980, and was conducted at the Marshall Space Flight Center in Alabama. After retiring, the tank was put on display at the Kennedy Space Center until 2013. After that, it was sold at an auction into a private collection. The auction winner lived in Keystone Heights, Florida. The tank was transported to Green Cove by a barge. The transporters attempted to move the tank further by road, but they failed. They would have had to close the highway and disconnect power lines to do it. So it remained lying where we can see it now. Submarines are meant to be underwater, so it's no wonder that this unique Japanese submarine has turned into a pile of rust. It spent too much time lying on the ground and ended up far from home, on an island near Alaska. During World War II, the island was under Japanese control for a while, which is probably why the submarine ended up there in the first place. According to eyewitness descriptions, the shape of the 24-meter vessel once resembled a killer whale. In 1942, there were 6 such submarines on the island. Despite their size, these submarines were designed for only 2 soldiers. By the end of 1943, Japan was expelled from the island, but the soldiers didn't have enough time to return the submarines to Japan. This wreckage of a submarine is known as the Yellow Submarine of Coney Island Creek. The submarine was previously part of a project to salvage the wreckage of the cruise ship Andrea Doria, which sank near Nantucket in 1956. An inattentive crane operator destroyed this idea in 1971. The submarine had to be carefully lowered into the water to gradually fill the ballast. But instead, the operator dropped it abruptly, and the submarine sank. They later raised it from the bottom, but it was so severely damaged that it could no longer be restored. Now it's become home to bird nests and blue crabs. The forgotten Aerotrain is a monument to General Motors' failed vision of future transportation in the 1950s. In the 1940s and 50s, the company supplied parts to train manufacturers, and over time, they decided to build their own train. It was supposed to be inexpensive and very fast. They achieved speed, but no one thought about comfort. The Aerotrain was made of aluminum and was lighter than any of its competitors. Its light weight allowed it to reach high speeds, over 160 kilometers per hour, which was very impressive at the time. Unfortunately, speed came at a price. Passengers were tossed from side to side on turns, and the Aerotrains had a hard time climbing hills. By 1957, it became evident that the idea was impractical, and now all these trains are museum exhibits. This is a mysterious locomotive graveyard on the plains of the Andes in southwestern Bolivia. In this abandoned place, there are over 100 abandoned carriages and locomotives dating back to the 19th century. In the past century, a large railway network was planned for Uyuni, but due to technical difficulties and strained relations with neighboring countries, the plans were cancelled, and the trains and equipment were left abandoned. The salty winds blowing over the nearby Salar de Uyuni, the world's largest salt flat, have eaten away at the thick metal. Elvis Presley loved luxury and lived like a king. And of course, he had personal planes. He owned 3 planes, which he used for both work and leisure. He sold the first 2 planes but then bought them back and parked them at the hotel where they still stand today. The king of rock and roll bought the 3rd plane, a 1962 Lockheed Jetstar, as a Christmas present to himself in 1976, just 8 months before his death. Elvis paid $840,000 for the plane, which is equivalent to approximately $4.4 million today. After Elvis's death, the plane was sold. It eventually ended up at an international aviation center in the New Mexico desert. The plane was stored there until relatively recently. Judging by its external condition, by the time it was decided to put the plane up for auction, it had deteriorated significantly. It had been clearly abandoned for many years. The engines and many components of the cockpit were stripped, and the paint had faded noticeably. Inside, there were rotating red velvet seats designed for 6 passengers. The cabin was decorated with golden suede, with a red carpet on the floor. The onboard entertainment system included an RCA television, a videocassette player, and a cassette audio player, as well as headphone jacks with sound controls at each seat. It seems that the plane was customized to Elvis's taste, but it's unclear how often he used it during the short time he owned it. The plane was sold for $260,000 to an anonymous buyer at an auction in early 2023, on what would have been the singer's 88th birthday. Luxury cars of reputable brands are usually kept in garages. The English were shocked when they saw footage of a Range Rover graveyard with hundreds of luxurious 4-wheel drive vehicles abandoned to rot on a hillside, covered in lush green grass in Wales. The cars are in varying conditions. Some look like they could still be driven at any moment, while others are partially dismantled for parts. Peering inside a couple of the Range Rovers, you can find nearly perfect interiors with high-end leather and wood trim. Some of the cars are missing bumpers, headlights, and even engines, and one has its entire interior stripped down for spare parts. These are mostly first and second generation cars, but they have a bad reputation for poor reliability and are often too expensive to repair. That's most likely why all these cars were abandoned and unwanted. The Chernobyl nuclear power plant accident cleanup was a challenging ordeal. Helicopters, engineering vehicles, and other specialized equipment that ended up in Chernobyl received a dose of radiation that rendered them unusable. The decision was made to bury and forget about all of this equipment for many decades. The equipment graveyard was simply massive. Rows of contaminated machines stood there. There were armored personnel carriers, trucks, ambulances, fire engines, buses, excavators, robotic bulldozers, and even heavy cargo helicopters, capable of lifting 50 tons of cargo at a time. The nuclear landfill equipment was in a highly deteriorated state. Some of it was reduced to mere skeletons. The few pieces of equipment that were most heavily irradiated were immediately buried in massive trenches. This landfill no longer exists today. All the equipment contaminated with deadly radiation has disappeared, and the area has been cleared. In 2012, all the equipment was sent for processing, leaving behind only occasional remnants, metal scraps, and sporadically radioactive spots. The Duke of Lancaster ship is an impressive vessel that deserved a much better fate than it received. It was built and launched in 1955, with its primary purpose being the transportation of people from Heysham in England to Belfast in Northern Ireland. Over time, its responsibilities were expanded, and it began ferrying passengers to Spain, Denmark, Norway, and the Netherlands. The ship had room for 1,200 standard-class passengers and an additional 600 first-class passengers who enjoyed VIP service. It all came to an end in 1974, when the Heysham-Belfast route was closed. The ship was considered outdated as it lacked many of the modern amenities, such as the ability to transport cars. The ship continued to operate on short routes for a while longer, but it was eventually abandoned in docks in North Wales in 1979. It was converted into a party ship and named the Fun Ship. Various entertainment venues and bars were set up on board, but it was closed in the mid-1980s. Recently, a team of international graffiti artists known as the Dudug Collective used it as a blank canvas to showcase the latest trends in street art. Once, the Galaxy cruise ship was a magnificent structure, but today, it doesn't look like it. It's hard to find any information about this massive floating hotel because no one knows how the ship ended up abandoned on Koh Chang Beach in Thailand. The locals avoid discussing it because the ship has some eerie legends going around about it. Allegedly, anyone who climbed on board to explore it never returned. Judging by the interior, the ship was abandoned hastily. Many cabins still contain guest belongings, and some rooms still have beds and bedding. Some parts of the ship are in better condition than others, but now it only matters to the cats and dogs that have made the ship their home. The ship is enormous and cost its owners hundreds of millions of dollars, but now it only generates an income of $20 per visit, collected by the guard who watches over it. Of course, this is a rather sad sight, but we'll try to change your mood now. Just imagine the surprise of the residents of Les Sables d'Olonne in France when they discovered a massive 88-meter-long ship on the sand of their central beach. The ship was not abandoned but was washed ashore due to the incompetence of its captain. The cargo ship Artemis from Lisbon was approaching the port of Les Sables to load 3,500 tons of wheat destined for Rouen. However, the captain's plans were disrupted by a strong wind blowing at a speed of 90 kilometers per hour. The cargo ship was carried like a feather and drifted toward the main beach, where it got grounded at 7:20 in the morning. The ship wasn't damaged but provided 11 days of entertainment for curious locals and tourists from all over France. Well, that's all for today, friends. Like the video if you found it interesting. Share your thoughts in the comments, let me know what you learned from this one, and we'll see you next time.